Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're taking a really hard look at the UK's green energy transition. You hear the promise all the time, right? Net zero, cheap, clean power for everyone. But, well, the reality for people, for industry, it seems to be soaring electricity bills. And that's happening even as we're building, record amounts of wind capacity. So our mission today is to sift through this pile of sources. We've got data points, policy critiques, financial figures. We want to understand this kind of disconnect. Why are energy costs so incredibly high when we're generating so much clean power?
Yeah, and when you look at the data, the central tension, it just jumps out at you. The UK has basically prioritized building the generation, lots of it, especially wind in Scotland, but it's done that, well, much faster than the grid, the actual pipes, can handle. So you've got this potentially cheap supply, huge amounts of it, but the delivery mechanism, it's kind of broken. And that leads directly, inevitably really, to this massive financial waste, which at the end of the day gets pushed onto you, the listener, as higher prices.
Okay, let's talk about that waste then, the financial side of it. If we look at wind curtailment that's paying wind farms not to produce power, the figures just for this year, 2025 so far, are pretty alarming. We're already over $1 billion spent just on these curtailment payments.
£1 billion just to switch off clean energy. And it's accelerating fast. If you put that in context, look at last year, 2024, the full year figures show consumers paid over £393 million. And that was to discard around 8.3 terawatt hours of wind energy. Now, 8.3 TWH, it's about 10% of all the wind power generated in the UK that year. It's power that was made, paid for, subsidized, and then just, well, thrown away because the grid couldn't take it.
Right. And the core of this, as the sources really highlight, it's this bottleneck problem. Where is it actually happening? Where's the crunch point?
It's overwhelmingly geographic. It's about the Scotland-England boundary mainly. You see, most of the UK's new wind power is way up in northern Scotland, but the cables, the transmission lines heading south, they just aren't big enough. So National Grid, the operator, they're forced to pay Scottish wind farms to shut down, while also paying gas plants, often down south near cities, to fire up just to keep the lights on and the system stable. The data for the first half of 2025 alone is stark. 4 TWh of potential wind energy was curtailed just in northern Scotland. That cost $116 million. And maybe the most telling part, that wasted energy could have powered every single home in Scotland for a whole year.
Wow. That really puts the opportunity cost into perspective. And it highlights cases like the Seagreen offshore wind farm. Looking at the 2024 numbers for them, Seagreen got $65 million.
That's right, $65 million. Specifically for curtailing 71% of its potential output.
71%.
Yes, it's an extraordinary situation. It becomes cheaper, or rather less costly, to pay them not to generate than risk destabilizing the entire grid.
Okay, so that's the individual farm level.
Huh.
How does this scale up these system costs?
Exactly. This feeds into what National Grid calls its balancing costs. That's basically the money spent managing the grid second by second, keeping supply and demand matched up when things get messy. These balancing costs hit £2.7 billion in 2024, and a huge chunk of that was driven by this exact curtailment issue. It's the cost of managing the grid's instability.
$2.7 billion. And if a system operator's spending that much just keeping things stable, how quickly does that filter down to, say, factories or my bill at home? What's this doing to UK business competitiveness?
It creates a massive, massive drag. All the evidence shows these balancing costs, plus the eventual cost of grid upgrades, they're just passed right through. Our data shows UK industrial electricity prices are around 25.85 pence per kilowatt hour. That puts the UK at the very top, the highest among the 28 countries the IEA tracks. We're talking about 46% above the median price in that group. Manufacturing here just can't compete with energy costs like that.
And it's not just industry feeling the pinch, is it? What about households?
No, absolutely not. Household prices. Well, back in the second half of 2022, they were about 0.36 per kilowatt hour, which was roughly 93% higher than the median across the EU and UK at that time. Now, you have to be a bit careful. Some places like Cyprus, Ireland, islands basically, have sometimes had higher retail rates. But there's no denying the UK is consistently right up there among the most expensive.
Okay, and this brings up the big question, though. If we are generating so much wind power, and wind is supposed to be cheap, why isn't that cheapness pushing prices down? Why is gas still setting the price?
That's the well, multi-billion pound question, really. It's the market mechanism, the gas link. Even with all this renewable capacity built, the UK's wholesale electricity price, the price everyone gets paid, is still set by the price of gas 98% of the time.
98%. How does that work?
It's called marginal pricing. Think of it like a queue. The cheapest generators, wind, solar, nuclear, they get used first. But the price paid to all generators is set by the cost of the very last, most expensive generator needed to meet the demand at that specific moment. And almost always, that last unit needed comes from a gas-fired power station, which is relatively expensive to run.
So even if wind is powering half the country for free, essentially, the second demand ticks up and you need that extra bit from a gas plant, boom, the price for everyone jumps up to match the gas cost.
Precisely. Gas is still the main flexible generator we rely on to balance things out. Look at the first quarter of 2025. Gas was still 38.6% of generation. Wind was 28.5%. So the market structure locks in that high marginal price from gas, basically wiping out the price benefit of the cheaper renewables we have, at least until we reform how the market actually works.
Which leads us straight into the policy gap, doesn't it? Storage seems like the obvious missing piece here. If you could store that 8.3 TWh of wasted wind.
Exactly. Store it when it's windy and cheap, release it when it's needed, smooth things out. And the data we've seen suggests that deploying large-scale energy storage, things like big batteries or pumped hydro, could save the UK system somewhere between 500 million and 3.5 billion pounds every single year.
3.5 billion.
And crucially, it would let us actually use around 11 TWh more wind energy annually that we currently just waste.
Okay, the potential savings are that huge, up to 3.5 billion pounds a year, and it helps use the energy we're already making. Why isn't there this massive push for storage? Why aren't we seeing billions pouring into it?
Well, it seems like a classic case of infrastructure planning lagging behind generation targets. Policy has often focused on the headline figures, let's build X gigawatts of wind, because that's an easier political announcement perhaps. It's much harder, takes longer, involves more complex planning to sort out the grid upgrades and the storage. Remember those 2.7 billion in balancing costs? And the grid upgrades now being debated are costing a massive 6.6 billion.
6.6 billion.
Yes, and that money is only really being talked about seriously because the system is creaking at the seams, not because of proactive policy years ago.
Right. Let's shift focus slightly then to this gap between policy and reality. You've got these high costs, wasted energy. It creates a sort of credibility problem for political promises, doesn't it?
Absolutely. You can look at pledges made, for instance, by Ed Miliband when he was Shadow Energy Secretary. He talked about a specific goal, cutting household energy bills by £300 thanks to expanding clean energy. But, experts are warning quite widely that any potential saving like that could just be completely wiped out. Wiped out by the rising costs from grid problems and the subsidies needed to manage the current system, so the cost of the system's failures erodes the benefit of its successes.
And it's not just commentators saying this.
No, independent bodies, too. The Climate Change Committee, the CCC, they warned just this past June 2025, that effectively no progress had actually been made on cutting household power bills. And on top of that, the government's own forecasts for how much wind power will actually get delivered have been cut. They're now expecting 20–30% less than they previously thought. So the system's expensive and under-delivering on its own targets.
And you have to assume this impacts public support for the whole net zero project, especially if people link it directly to their bills.
That's exactly what the sources show. Basic support for the idea of net zero is pretty solid, 55–60%. But that support flips dramatically. You see opposition jump up maybe 70% against as soon as the policy gets directly tied to higher costs for households.
So the policy needs to actually work affordably to stay politically viable.
Precisely. It has to deliver, not just promise.
Okay, let's zoom out for a second. Put all this domestic effort and cost into a global context.
Right. The global impact perspective. If you look at the UK's total contribution to global emissions, from burning fuels, it's only about 0.8% of the global total.
0.8%.
Yes. So while every bit counts, of course, the huge domestic costs and all this policy focus, it's delivering a, pretty modest dent in the overall global picture.
That small percentage makes the high domestic cost and the grid chaos seem even harder to justify politically, perhaps.
Yeah.
And how do we compare to the really big emitters, like China?
Well, there's an interesting comparison in the sources. China's emissions per person are now roughly the same as the UK's per-person emissions.
Really? Per capita parity?
Roughly, yes. Even though China's total annual emissions are vastly bigger, about 11.9 gigatons of CO2 in 2024. So it kind of highlights that maybe the UK's immediate pressing challenge isn't so much about leading global climate policy, but more about getting its own house in order stabilizing its grid, making energy affordable for its own people.
Okay, final thread before we wrap up. Let's touch briefly on the other costs. Not the financial ones, but the environmental trade-offs that come with building out wind power so quickly.
Yes, that's important too. Wind is clean energy, absolutely. But building and operating the turbines, especially offshore, it does have an environmental impact. The sources point to concerns about seabird and bat deaths, thousands across Europe linked to offshore wind. Sometimes the rush to build means environmental checks might be less thorough.
But there are ways to mitigate that, aren't there? I remember hearing about painting blades.
Yes, there was a promising trial, a 2020 Norwegian study at the Smala wind farm. They painted just one blade of a turbine black, and it reportedly reduced overall bird strikes by 71%, even more for certain large raptors like white-tailed eagles, 80% reduction.
70%. That sounds like a simple, effective fix. Why isn't every turbine blade painted black then?
Well, that's where it gets complicated. Follow-up studies haven't always replicated those results. For instance, a Dutch test in 2025 in Eemshaven found no measurable reduction in bird strikes from the black blade.
Ooh, so mixed results.
Very mixed. It suggests it might depend on the location, the specific bird species, other factors, so it's not a simple silver bullet. But the underlying issue remains. The estimates suggest offshore wind across Europe might be linked to over 500,000 bird deaths a year. That's a non-financial cost that regulators still need to grapple with alongside the grid costs.
Okay, so let's try and pull all these threads together,
Yeah.
synthesizing everything we've discussed today. What's a core diagnosis?
I think the diagnosis is unfortunately pretty clear from the sources. The UK has been really ambitious, maybe even successful, in boosting generation capacity, building the power plants, but it's critically failed on the system integration side. The market structure is wrong, the grid capacity isn't there, and crucially, there's not enough storage. And this failure to integrate the system, this bottleneck, where we literally pay billions to not use clean power, that is the direct reason consumers and industry are facing these incredibly high prices.
Right. So the key takeaway for you, listening, is that this whole situation seems to boil down to a fundamental misalignment. We've prioritized the volume of renewables, maybe because it's an easy metric to announce politically, over the much harder, less glamorous work of system integration, the engineering needed to actually use it effectively. We're paying billions for energy we then throw away, while also paying near-record high prices for the energy we do manage to use. And that leaves us with our final provocative thought for you to take away and think about. We've clearly established the UK is building generation faster than its grid can cope, leading to hundreds of millions, now billions, in wasted energy payments. We also know that fixing this big grid upgrades, massive storage deployment, could potentially save the system up to $3.5 billion a year. So the question is, why does the policy focus, the political energy, still seem geared primarily towards building more generation capacity? Rather than fixing the critical infrastructure bottleneck that we know is already costing the country billions, where's the will to fix foundations, instead of just keep adding floors to a shaky building?